we as clinicians walk a step back and say, well, maybe we don't know what's best, and just let people figure things out on their own.
All right. So believe it or not, I don't always just follow postpartum professionals and pelvic health people. Sometimes I dabble a little bit in kind of sports and orthopedics. And that's how I found Rich Willy. And he's known as Mountain Land Sports. Did I get that right? On
Montana Running Lab.
Montana Running Lab. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. Oh,
that's okay.
See, I screwed it right off the bat.
We're off to
Montana, and it's right in front of me too. I found Rich on Instagram, and I've been following his stuff and love it. And so I'm so glad to have Rich on the podcast to chat about myths in running, just period. So thanks for coming on, even though I totally messed up your IG.
Oh, that's okay. Thanks, Carrie. It's really, really awesome to be here. So I appreciate it. And I really enjoy your feed as well. It's super helpful to me. And I don't treat a lot of individuals who are postpartum. So it's really helpful for me to see that feed.
Cool. Yeah, there's a lot of crossover. It's funny. With my background in orthopedics and pelvic health for so long, they kind of ran in two parallel kind of universes. And at some point, it just made more sense for them to collide. And because there's not great research in pelvic health and return to sport, it really, we've had to look at research like yours and others in the sports ortho space, because you guys are looking at like return to sport, stress injuries, patellofemoral sorts of things. There's impact involved, which obviously with pelvic health, we need to kind of take a peek at that too. So I wanted you to kind of just dive into just basic running myths, because so many of our moms and even our professionals maybe don't know that there's been some updates. So maybe you could just dive into the top 3 running myths that you kind of just wish would disappear.
Oh yeah, it's really, for me, I find this to be a really fun area, and in particular because I used to believe a lot of these myths as well. And so much has changed in the last decade. I came out with my PhD in 2011 in biomechanics, and at the time I thought, biomechanics really was the big cause of many injuries, and of course that was my bias. But I've been a clinician for 20 plus years, and so and I still treat, and so you start to see, and you look at the literature, and you're starting to see that some of these kind of strongly held beliefs that even I had maybe don't necessarily pan out. So I think a couple of them would be, I think stretching is a good one. And so I think that, we as PTs, if something hurts, we're taught, or maybe our bias is to stretch it. And when you look at the literature, people who fail to stretch are not at greater risk for running related injuries. And also too, that stretching doesn't seem to have a major role in recovering from most, if not all, running related injuries as well. So I think stretching is one of those things that is probably overemphasized. I think people spend maybe perhaps too much time on it. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with stretching. I wouldn't be one of those that would say that stretching is bad for you and you're harming yourself. I would just say that if you're doing stretching, understand that you're probably doing it for perhaps reasons such as relaxation or stress relief, but it's probably not doing anything to I would say reduce your risk of experiencing a running related injury. So I would say that was probably number one.
So we can stop the guilt trip that we didn't stretch today. We're okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
One less thing to take off my list.
Yeah, right. And I think that too. I mean, if stretching's part of your warm up routine, that's great. And I think that along those lines, I would encourage individuals to explore other ways to warm up as well. And you never know. I mean, maybe it's something that you've been practicing all along. There might be other alternatives out there that might be better. And so, maybe as part of your warm-up routine, perhaps doing some jumping jacks or some sort of plyometric type activity, because really running is basically a plyometric. It's just basically repetitive hopping. And so if you're doing a lot of long stretching before you do that, and then you ask yourself then to do something totally opposite of that, which would be kind of like this bouncing type activity, it makes sense maybe perhaps to do some bouncing to warm up for that. So that would be one thing I would encourage people to think about too. And I think the other part along those lines too is maybe perhaps the time that you spend stretching each week, you think about replacing some of that time with some heavy strength training, I think would also
Yeah.
do a lot of us a lot of good, as well. And understand too that, again, while you might enjoy stretching and all those things, I think it's important to think about that you might be taking time away from doing things that might be more beneficial for you. And so strength training that's my bias. I do a lot of strength training. I didn't used to. I
Yeah, same
personally,
here.
I personally had a musculoskeletal injury that I was having a lot of trouble recovering from. I had hip FAI surgery, and
Oh, me too.
oh, did you? Oh, yeah, good, yeah,
Yeah.
good time. Hopefully, you did better than I did. I really struggled with that injury.
At first, not good. Like mine was 15 years ago.
Oh, yeah, uh-huh.
Yeah, and
So
so
you were in that
nobody
first wave of people
Yes,
who'd had it done.
exactly, exactly,
Hmm.
like, nobody knew the rehab, and so it was really frustrating to think, "Oh, yeah, this is gonna make you great," and then I think I finally found somebody that with an hour of prep, I could go run, and that was before kids, and I'm like, "I don't have this time before kids, I sure as hell don't have time
Hmm.
after," and that's actually how I found CrossFit was because of the load and made a big difference in how my hip felt and my running, so
Yeah, and that's very similar to me. When the program I went through, the rehab protocol. I mean, I had my PhD at the time, and I was treating a lot of musculoskeletal
yeah.
injuries. I knew a little bit about hip FAI, and that's not really saying a lot because people didn't really know very much about it
No,
at all.
uh-uh.
And I was working in Colorado in the mid 2000s when Mark Philippon
I was
started
gonna say,
doing.
did Philippon do your surgery?
No, no, he didn't. I had it
Okay,
done at Ohio State, and
okay.
so we started getting a lot of these hip arthroscopies in
Yes.
the mid 2000s, and we were kind of like, well, I think I know what to do rehab wise, and at the time, I guess maybe this is another good kind of myth would be that, well, we're like, well, it's a hip and they're a runner or they're some sort of other lower limb athlete, so we need to do a lot of glute strengthening with this person.
Right,
And so when I had my hip surgery done in 2012, that was basically the program that I was given, and the rehab I was doing was a lot of gluteus medius, gluteus
right.
maximus type strength training. And and really what I found was that it wasn't really helping me very much at all.
No.
And so I was like, well, let's flip this on its end and do something exactly opposite. So rather than doing a lot of hip extensor and hip abductor strengthening, I started doing a lot of hip flexor and hip
Yes.
adductor strengthening. And I started, rather than doing a lot of body weight stuff, I shifted to doing a lot of heavy
Yep.
strengthening exercises. And so the more that I did that, the better I felt. And in fact, I started doing that as my warm up. I would do some heavy strength training and then I would go for a run. And
Mhm.
that seemed to be very helpful. And I did have a really hard time coming back from that injury. It took me over 2 years to get back to get back to running. And so I think that I think we have an overemphasis on the role of the glutes
I
with running.
agree.
And I think that if you pick up Runner's World or Triathlete Magazine or something like that, you still see that there's still that heavy emphasis on that. I would say that Runner's World started to get a lot better about that. And they're starting to say, well, this is maybe running is not such a gluteal activity, but and in fact, running is very much a plantar flexor or a calf type activity.
Yep.
And so if you're pinched for time, I would say that your best bet is to probably spend a lot of time doing a lot of plantar flexor strengthening. So a lot of heavy weighted or heavy calf raises.
Mhm.
I think one of the best places to do those is in a Smith machine
Yeah.
where you've got good stability. You don't have to worry about balancing yourself, and you can just focus on getting a lot of load on yourself. And so running is, when you run, about 50% of what we call our support moment comes from our plantar flexors. And so we need to spend a lot of time on that. And then I think the next thing then to do is probably, if you have an area that has been injured in the past, that's likely where you're going to get injured again in the future. And
Yeah.
so, for instance, if you've had patellofemoral pain in the past, when you go out and make some sort of training load error where you maybe run too many downhills or increase your speed work too quickly or something like that, if you're going to get an overuse injury, it's probably going to be patellofemoral pain. So you should probably pick a couple exercises that might be helpful for patellofemoral pain. And I would say like very targeted quadricep strengthening, I think would be very helpful. Yeah, so I think doing just a few exercises several times per week that involve lifting some heavy weight. I really encourage people to join a gym. because I think that it's a small price in the grand scheme of things when it comes to improving your overall running health, but also your musculoskeletal health. And now we're starting to see that strength training, particularly heavy strength training, has a lot of cognitive benefits too, as far as across the lifespan, and of course there are all the benefits when it comes to bone health as well.
Oh,
And so,
exactly. Yeah.
and so I think that those things are just really hard to replicate at home. And I know for me, so we have an 8-year-old, and my wife and I are really good about co-parenting, and we know that if we're at home lifting we have a wonderful gym in our garage, and I walk right past that gym, hop on my bike or hop in my car and go down to our gym and, and work out. And it's because our 8-year-old comes out and he's like, "What's going on, guys?" And he wants to hang out, and I love
Yes.
him to death. But I think like getting that concentrated time, alone, where
It's
you can
hard.
invest in yourself, I
Yeah.
think is really important.
But some of
So
the things you just said, I thought I think they've resonated with my population, and what we saw for a long time before we had running readiness screens like with Grain Donnelly and Tom Goom, like just even looking at, like you're saying, plantar flexion, like how many heel raises can you do? Because there's so much kind of atrophy that comes through pregnancy. What does that balance look like? Can you handle impact? And then the other thing that comes up a lot is moms that just go back to running without strengthening. They get recurrence of these old injuries from back in their 20s or high school running days or things like that. And that's what sidelines them. They don't even get to the point where, they're having pelvic floor issues because they're not even running yet. And it's those basic kind of orthopedic things that I think just get completely missed. And then these moms are, 5, 10 years out, their kids in middle school, and they're still not running again. And that's not how they want to be for their kids.
right.
But yeah, it's just it's unreal, just the basic stuff that gets missed because we hyper focus right to the pelvic floor, and it's like, actually no, these other things really do still matter, because if you're not running during pregnancy, or you've gotten weaker, you have these old injuries that haven't been resolved, and you're not doing anything to strengthen, you can't just go out and just run and think that it's going to be fine. Plus we're getting older.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and that's the thing, is that the number one predictive factor on whether or not you're going to get an injury is if you've had that injury in the past.
Right.
So we know that if you've had patellofemoral pain, 50 to 80% of people will have a recurrence of that, even if they've completed rehabilitation. We see that with patellar tendinopathy, over 50% will get that again. Achilles tendinopathy, the same thing as well. And bone stress injuries, if you've had a bone stress injury anytime in your life, anywhere in your body, so if you've had a tibial bone stress injury, you have a 6-fold increased risk of having that injury again. Somewhere else in your body, you can get another bone stress injury. If you're male, it's a little bit higher, actually. It's 7-fold.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, males have a little bit higher risk of having a subsequent one. So
that's interesting. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that, that first off, I mean, bone stress injuries are really complicated. And I would say it's the most complicated injury that I certainly treat. And that a lot of times that those underlying risk factors are not resolved. People get the bone stress injury. They're like, oh, well, just let it heal. Then I'll go back to running. And they don't resolve some of the things such as energy deficit issues, perhaps some strength deficits. And they continue to make a lot of the same training load errors, perhaps.
I see.
So that's the reason why a lot of these injuries tend to be very persistent. And, and as when we're recovering from something such as pregnancy or what have you, and you've had a long time off from running, it's important to realize that, it's not just your pelvic floor that's lost capacity. The rest of your body has lost capacity as well too. And so, again, reflecting back on my own experience with that hip FAI surgery that I had, I was just following one of my own standard return to running programs that starts off with like a minute of running and 5 cycles of that, rotating with like 2 minutes of walking. And I was getting really frustrated with that. And then I realized that was actually just too much running for me. And so I started off with 15 seconds of running. And it took me 6 months to get back because I'd had 2 years off without any running, and it takes, you adapt very slowly. And I think, different tissues adapt at different rates. And so muscle adapts very quickly, bone adapts very slowly. It's on the other end of the spectrum, and you have to give it all a chance to catch up with yourself, as you're going forward.
That makes a lot of sense. We see that more in the context of like Red S, where, you've got depleted, you're fatigued, your nutrition isn't great. You've got all these other factors hormonally. And I just don't think moms are necessarily aware that this can result in bone stress injuries. And then also too, like looking at getting back to running, I think we go to what's easy. We Google and couch to 5Ks come up and we think, oh, 5 minutes on, 5 minutes off, that's enough. But to your point, sometimes that's way too much. And starting back slowly, I have a modified program that I'll do with moms where I'm like, look, we'll find that baseline that we start at, but I'm going to have you do that at least 3 different sessions. So that way you buy the confidence that you know that it's okay. It can be in the morning, it can be at night, because obviously, prolapse, leakage, that can change depending on time of day and fatigue and all of that.
Yeah,
But like
exactly.
to buy them the confidence, but I think we also get some underlying physiological benefits from just time under that task too, and to go slowly, so we're not, because it's too hard when, I think this is any athlete, when you overshoot and then you have to deal with that mental, fallout from, oh my gosh, am I ever going to get there? Am I ever going to finish? And I'd rather undershoot all day long.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think like we know that as I mentioned, bone tends to lag behind muscle development.
Yeah.
And I think a really good way to think about it is that muscle and bone have this, or muscle exerts a synergistic dominance on bone, meaning
Mhm.
that muscle can't do its job without having a bone to attach to,
Yeah.
and it needs to have the lever arms, and there's a lot of hormonal crosstalk between muscle and bone. As a, and of course a bone won't get stronger unless it has a muscle that's attached to it, that's pulling on it
Right.
and stretching it and twisting it, and that's how a bone will get stronger. And so we used to think too, I don't want this to count as one of our myths, but
It doesn't. You're good.
we used to think
You're cut off.
we used to think that that impacts really related a lot to how we can what results in bone growth and stuff, and it does.
Yeah.
But really what it is, it's the muscle that is attenuating the impact, not the impact, not the
Not the
hit, not
impact
the force of the
itself.
ground. Yeah. So
Ah.
when muscle pulls on bone, it excites these bone cells, these osteoblasts and osteoclasts, to do their job and
Yeah.
break down bone and then build new bone up. And so when you think about it, like anytime you have, like, and you think about like the soleus, which is your big deep calf muscle, when it contracts, it bends that tibia backward,
Mhm.
and by doing that, it excites all the bone cells, and then that's how we lay down new bone. And of course, when we jump, the number one contributing muscle to jumping is indeed the soleus. And so it's a lot of times we used to think that the impact was what was really important, but really it's the muscle that gets us up off the ground and then helps attenuate
Ah.
that load. So I would say that there's probably an overemphasis and on impacts when it comes to perhaps improving bone health, but also there's an overemphasis on impacts when it comes to injuries as well. I think we think too much of impacts. I don't think they're really quite as important. It's really the muscle forces that are really
Yeah.
important. And so that again goes back to why you need to have a really strong musculoskeletal system to basically,
Right.
to absorb and have the capacity for those the muscular demands of running, if you will.
Yeah. Oh,
So
that's really interesting. I always kind of think, and again, with the readiness screening, like if everything down below, like distally, if it's not doing its job to be able to handle that impact, then I kind of feel like the pelvic floor is sort of left holding the ball. Like, and
mhm.
that's where, again, if you just hyper focus on pelvic floor, you totally miss the boat. So you have to look at these other areas and understand where something isn't, you kind of holding up its end of the bargain. And I think it's hard when you have a lot of pelvic PTs that don't have that additional background or don't have somebody in sports ortho to collaborate with that understands those concepts, that I really feel like there's a piece that ends up missing.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think, like, and PTs, I don't know, like, I come from a medical family. My father was a physician, and
Oh, okay.
and one of the things that growing up, he did consultations
Hmm.
with other physicians all the time, and he sent out patients for consultation. It was just something very that physicians did. PTs are very reluctant to do that. We don't really consult with others very well, and it's a weird thing, and I hope that we get better about that. I don't
Yeah.
know. For me, and I can tell you that for me, like, I know when it comes to a patient, who has pelvic floor issues, I'm not the person to see for that, but I know who to send that person to, and I know
Yep.
that I can do the screenings for that and can recognize. And I've got a great person that I send all those patients to, because I know I can help them with the musculoskeletal component for their into
Exactly.
running, and I
Yep.
need to work together with someone else, and I'm not going to be the person who can solve all this person's challenges that they're dealing with at the
Yeah.
time. So, but yeah, I mean, back to that impact thing. I think that one of the things, so we used to think that if you hit the ground very stiff, that your bone forces were greater. But really, when you look at the amount of load on a bone, and we'll talk about the tibia, for instance, that the contribution to total bone force, or the bone stress, total bone force on the tibia is about 8 to 9 body weights when we run, which
Hmm.
sounds like a tremendous amount. And we all know that when you run, your vertical ground reaction force, we often hear that you hit the ground with about 2.5 times your body weight. So if you've got 9 body weights of force on the tibia, and you only have 2.5 times your body weight coming from the ground reaction force, then you have to ask yourself, well, where is that other six and a
Where to
half percent
go?
coming
Right.
from? It's coming from the muscle. So,
Mm.
so the muscles that are attached to the bone are really the biggest contributors. And so with that said, that if you are cueing someone to land really soft who has a bone stress injury, you're actually increasing their bone forces, their bone twisting
Ah,
forces.
interesting.
And so we
Okay.
used to think that people who hit the ground very hard and all that stuff had really high bone forces, but it's actually the opposite.
It's the
So
opposite.
it's the
Ah.
opposite of that. So we're starting to see us now as like new muscle modeling techniques are coming online, and we're being able to see and look at different things. And so if you look at downhill running actually has a slightly less tibial bone force, even though your impacts are higher, because your
Hmm.
muscles aren't using as much as uphill running. Uphill running actually increases load on the tibia more than downhill running. So that just goes to show you how important the muscle is
Oh,
that's
that's really
attaching to the bone.
interesting. That
Mm-hmm.
might, I'm sure there's some crossover. Like I'll have clients with leakage or prolapse issues, which obviously we're concerned with impact and pressure and that sort of thing. And it's funny, you'll have some that uphill is a big problem for them, and some it's downhill. And
Mm-hmm.
so maybe it's worth diving into that a little bit more to see what's going on down the chain.
Yeah, I think so. I think that, and again, this always goes back to why we should always be kind of challenging some of the assumptions that we hold near and
Yeah.
dear to us, is that we might be wrong. And I think
Yeah.
like, well, why is that? And if someone says something, this is when I also teach in a program, and I tell our students, like, look, if you hear something and you're like, you have like a little bit of emotional recoil, or that
Yeah.
cognitive dissonance, you should step back and say, well, why do I hold that belief so near and dear to
Yes.
myself? Write that stuff down, and then go look that stuff up and make sure that you're right, because you might be wrong. And it
Yep.
might be something that has come along since then that is telling you that, hey, maybe you need to reconsider what you're thinking. So,
That's great advice.
um,
A lot of people don't do that enough later on in their career. We hold on to these things for a really long time, and
mhm.
we don't ever reflect on why we still hold on to them.
Yeah, no, I know. Yeah, I think it's very true. So maybe we'll make that one our third one, because I do have a couple
Okay,
other
all
ones,
right.
but yeah, but just because we
No, I
talked
was gonna
about
say that you can have
muscle.
a couple extra ones there, and any other good ones that you've got that you think are important.
Yeah, I mean, maybe one last one, because you mentioned it earlier in this conversation, and that goes to red S. And I
Yeah.
think that before, and going back to my bias of coming out of my PhD thinking biomechanics was the reason why people got bone stress injuries, and now I actually think it's just one of probably a dozen plus reasons why
Yeah.
people get bone stress injuries. And I think of those, it's probably not as important as we used to think it is. And really, it has to
Mhm.
do with energy availability. Can this individual's physiology support the training load that this person is exerting on themselves? And I think that when you look at some of the literature, particularly some of the female athlete triad stuff that was
Yes.
around before we transitioned into Red S, there's a lot of emphasis on BMI, and we
Yep.
know too that that only a few percentage of people who are experiencing Red S have a low BMI,
Right.
and so it's very easy for us to think, oh well, that person has a normal body weight, and so they're not at risk for Red S, but they keep getting bone stress injuries. And what we're starting to really understand much more, so it's not so much, sure, the person who is in prolonged Red S, those people are at risk. But we're now starting to understand that very kind of micro bursts of Red S
Mhm.
really are one of the big reasons why people kind of get this, like, oh, I got this bone stress injury out of nowhere. And it might be that for whatever reason, running is a very energy intensive sport. Cycling is a very energy intensive sport. And it's not necessarily intentional. They just weren't meeting the energy demands of that activity for maybe the last
Right.
couple of weeks, particularly when they're leading up to a big event. That's when people tend to start watching their diet a little bit more closely. But then we start training at the same time. We're also training much more intensely. And, our volume perhaps is going up too. And so those tend to be very, very risky periods. So yeah, so I would say if you're a clinician, or really anybody, if you're saying, oh, I'm not, or this person's not at risk for RED-S, and that's not really a causative factor because, they don't fit what I think is what someone would
Yep.
look like who has an energy deficit. I think we should be very, very careful with that because we see that in people who decide to adopt like a paleo diet. If you want to get a bone stress injury, doing a lot of exercise, a lot of endurance exercise, and start on and doing a paleo diet. We see an increase in biomarkers of bone breakdown. They accumulate very, very quickly. And the reason is because it's not a carbohydrate intensive diet. And
Yep.
you don't have the energy to do your sport and also support your regular physiological mechanisms that you need to live. And part of
Yeah.
those is bone health and supporting your endocrine system, which is what you need for healthy bones.
Yeah, I think that
So,
comes up a ton in that postpartum population that they're trying to drop the baby weight, or
mhm.
they have this expectation, they want to get back to racing, they want to get back to something right away, and their body hasn't caught up to the nutritional demands that you need to breastfeed, waking up multiple times at night, like all of that. And I
Yeah.
think we normalize it. We're like, oh, this is just how it is. And unless you've gone through that, I don't think you necessarily, and this can be moms and dads, like, you don't necessarily appreciate how depleted you can get. And if it's your first time through, you're like, oh, well, this is just how it is. You don't realize how depleted those stores really get and how
Mhm.
important it is to have good nutrition and as much sleep as you can possibly get, and maybe kind of ramping down those expectations of trying to perform and get back to higher training loads, which is hard for our elite athletes that we're seeing now that are
Mhm.
trying to get back to that level and compete and meet their sponsors' demands and that sort of thing, but still also learning how to be a mom in their new body. So I feel like that's going to come up more. I think it's going to be more of hopefully more research and more of a conversation now that we're seeing more
Mhm.
voices that are in that space. So
Yeah,
cool.
I think like I don't know, my wife, and she wouldn't mind me sharing this, but she took her a good year to get back to running,
Yeah.
after the birth of our son. And and I think that it's really easy. I mean, you always hear about the elite athlete who had a kid and then was, ran like a great time at a
Right.
marathon, 16 weeks later. You never hear about the elite athlete that takes longer to get back.
Yeah.
And that's really unfortunate because I think that, and again, this is, I don't work with this population very closely often, but this is, at least from what I see and the patients that I treat, is that I think that's more the rule than I think the people you hear about are the exceptions. And then you start feeling like, oh, I should get back a little bit quicker. And you start holding
Yeah.
yourself to this other standard that maybe is not really, I mean, we're all human, you know?
Yeah,
So,
yeah, there was just an article, Margie Davenport, was in Sports Medicine Journal. It just came out, I think, the last week or two, looking at, really where we need to provide more support and more research and stuff like that. So the good news is we're having the conversation about it. But again, we just don't know a lot about how to return moms to elite level anything, and we're just kind of making it up as we go. So
mhm. Yeah.
cool. All right, next question. What are the biggest mistakes you see clinicians making with their return to run clients? So this is what you hear about in clinic, you see on social, like share the bad ones.
Yeah, I mean, I would say probably making not understanding the type of biomechanics that might be stressful for the injury that they're recovering from, and those are going to be different. So like depending on the injury. So patellofemoral pain, for instance, you need to uphill running is typically pretty easy. So if you want to get back to running and you're having some trouble getting back from patellofemoral pain, a good thing to do is do some uphill treadmill running, and it doesn't have to
Mhm.
be a big grade. So like a 3.5% grade. But if you've got someone who has Achilles tendinopathy or plantar heel pain or plantar fasciopathy, whatever you want to call it, that's going to be the exact wrong thing you should be doing, and
Yeah.
more level running and so forth. So I think like understanding the biomechanical loads that might be a little bit more stressful for that injury, and know that those are going to be the things you're going to have to add in later on.
Yeah.
And of course the athlete needs to go back to those things, and so you need to help give that that athlete some guardrails and work with them and understand where they're coming from, so you can kind of help start sprinkling those things in, and so it's not a big change for the person. So yeah, I would think that that's one of the biggest ones. I think too, I think like and I think just taking a step back even further from that is just doing what I used to do, which is just hand a return to run program to an athlete and
Yeah.
say, happy trails.
Yep.
Understanding that the person got injured because they probably made some sort of training load error, and the likelihood that they're going to make that same training load error when they're going back to running is very, very high. And that's one of the reasons
Yeah.
why we see such a high recurrence in these running related injuries, is because we probably don't spend as much time working with athletes and talking to them about, well, these are the things you got to be really careful about, and we need to, be a little bit more judicious with these types of loads. And I think being a very objective, and one of the things that I use a lot, I set up all of our runners with an app. It's a free app on, like, I don't know, the App Store or Google
Hmm.
Play. It's called Interval Timer, but they can program in there their time for that day, their rest walks, so they don't have to think about it. They can run
That's
with
nice.
headphones and stuff like
Yeah.
that, so they don't go, oh, and I did this too, when I was recovering from the various injuries I've had. I was like, oh, I feel pretty good today, rather than a minute of running 6 times. I'm going to go run. I'm going to make it 5 minutes. And then before you
Yep.
know it, you take a big step back, and you're back to ground zero.
I've found that too. Like the more prescriptive and just like intentional that you can be. And for moms, that works really well because we just want to shut our heads off and be told what to do and like, don't make me think this out or work it
Mhm.
out myself. So it works out really well. But I do think that the more prescriptive and controlled you can be about that going back, I think there's again less chance of overdoing and kind of, oh, I feel great. And then they go and screw everything up and now you're back to square one again.
Mhm. Yeah,
What
you
are your
feel great because you're following the program.
right, exactly,
So
imagine that.
that's not the time to say, "Oh, I feel great, so I'm gonna stop following the program and do what I wanna
Right,
do, what
yeah,
feels impulsive to me."
exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about, and I see a lot of clinicians that try and do a lot of, um, what's the best way to put this? They try and tell somebody that the reason why they're having injuries is not because of dosing or training or things like that, but because they're running wrong, and then they
Mm.
try and give them all these corrections. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so we don't for me, I don't do running evaluations on people who are uninjured.
Mhm.
And I kind of put that in the class of like over testing. And
Yeah,
so it's just like anything else. Like, we know that that a big part of overutilization of medical services because people are getting over tested for certain things. And I would consider gait evaluations for someone who's uninjured to be part of that. So we'll set that aside. I think that's not a good practice, in telling people that they move wrong, and and so forth. So yeah, I think too that so we used to think that biomechanics was a major driver of a lot of these running related injuries, and if someone maybe perhaps came to a course of mine a decade ago, they would probably hear me talk a lot about how important it is to really assess running biomechanics, and still I still teach how to do that, and I still do gait evals on everybody, just the same as if I'm seeing someone who has had a low back strain, I'm going to watch how they lift a box from the
right,
floor or do whatever else they have to do. But really, the reality of it is that it's that preparation that you're doing. It's how you got to that point, that really matters. And so, like, how quickly you're building up. What are your other physiological risk factors? We know, for instance, like tendinopathies, for instance, we know that if you, even in the last 9 to 12 months, if you took one of these big broad spectrum antibiotics such as Cipro or Levaquin or something like that, that sets you up for Achilles tendinopathy. And it might have,
yeah,
that has nothing to do with your running biomechanics
yep,
whatsoever. So I think that, yeah, I think this idea that you're getting injured because you're doing it wrong, meaning you're running wrong. I mean, I think, like, we know that a couple of really nice papers have come out recently, and one of them was, they looked at, they had coaches, very high level coaches, and they had them look at all these different runners, and of course they had all these runners had their physiological testing done, and so they knew their VO2 maxes and their running economy, and the
mhm,
coaches were asked to pick out who were the most economical runners,
mhm,
and they were wrong. They couldn't pick any of the they couldn't do it at all. And so we're talking about people who have an eye for running economy, and so when I see a coach monkeying with a particularly an adolescent athletes running
yeah,
mechanics, we have to understand that the way a person runs is this interaction between their anatomy, their physiology, and then their past running injury history. And so when we haven't had an injury, we subconsciously will shift a little bit of load. So if you've had a knee injury, you tend to shift the load away from your knee, and maybe that's okay. Maybe that's an okay thing to do. And we just need to kind of get that person prepared for the loads that they're going to experience during running through very smart training. And I think, again, a part of that is doing a lot of a very comprehensive and well thought out strength program.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. A lot of moms, when they come in after and they had started to run, things didn't work out, and then they find their way to someone like myself, like, they don't feel like they're running the same way, and what comes out of their mouth is like, "Oh, I'm running differently, I'm running wrong," or something like that, and it's very easy, I think, for a novice clinician to be like, "Yes, your stride length, you're not getting enough this, you're not getting enough that." And I think it's actually probably more a reflection of like what you're saying is you don't have the strength to propel yourself like you once did. It looks more effortful. It looks heavier. It looks plodding. And it probably feels that way too. But I do think it comes back more to having that underlying strength that really, again, over 9 months, people think, oh, I'm strong. I'm like, it's a different body. It's totally a
It is a
different
different body.
body.
It's a much different body. And the other part of it too is as we run, our running economy improves. And so
Hmm.
a collaborator of mine, Izzy Moore, she's from Wales,
Yeah.
and she's done a lot of work in this area, and she's done a lot of like postpartum, return
Yep.
to running work as well too. So and one of the things that she finds is that if someone just runs a new runner over 6 months, and you'll see that their running mechanics will gradually change as we start to optimize our movement patterns. And so we start to move in a more metabolically efficient way for
Hmm.
us. And so, and that's without anybody monkeying with it. It just happens very organically.
Yeah.
And so I think we need to make sure that, we as clinicians walk a step back and say, well, maybe we don't know what's best, and just let people figure things out on their own. And so, another way to look at this is, so like for us, so we do some gait retraining. We've done some gait retraining studies on this, and on people who have injuries and people who are uninjured as well, when we're just trying to see what's going to work the best. And one of the things that we see, one of the big changes we make, is we have runners who are experiencing like recovering from a bone stress injury, tibia in particular. We'll have them increase their step rate
Hmm.
or their cadence. And so you'll see a lot of clinicians be, okay, I want you to land with your knee more bent. I want you to land with a slightly flatter foot, and don't flex your hips so much, and so forth. But what we find is if we just give a runner like a cadence biofeedback thing, like
Yeah.
a Garmin that'll
Yep.
tell you what your cadence is in real time, the runner will look a certain way on day one, and then when you look at them 8 weeks later or 8 days later, they're going to slowly optimize and come up with the best kinematic solution to change their running cadence that's going to be the most efficient way for them to move. And it might be different for you, and it might be different for me.
Yep.
And I can't sit here and tell you when someone comes in, I know that they need to flex their knee more in order to increase their running cadence, or
Right.
they only they know that, and they have to figure it out on their own.
Yeah, no, I love that. I call that kind of the Spotify method where you're like, all right, find the playlist that works.
Mm-hmm.
Finding that, the weekend or something like that, that the tempo's right. But I think for again, for my population too, um, getting in the weeds sometimes keeps them from they're so worried that they're going to do something wrong, and they're so obsessed with, oh, maybe I should kegel when I run. I'm like, you can't control it. Like, you were not meant to cognitively control every single thing that happens, and chances are, if you try that, you're going to end up running actually even worse, and it's not going to be kind of what
Mm-hmm.
the intended result is. But there's so much of a desire that I want to come back and do this right. But right doesn't necessarily mean like over, detailed and over controlled and that sort of thing. But that's
Mm-hmm.
good to hear that, we can work it out on our own. Like we've evolved, right?
We have evolved, yeah. Yeah, I mean, we already have all those pathways in place. So
Yeah.
if you give, there's this idea of internal cueing versus external cueing, or focus of attention. And so if you tell someone to say squeeze your glutes more when you're running, or something along those lines, it's very difficult for them to do that. The
Yeah.
metabolic cost of running goes through the roof.
Yeah.
And if you want to make running more difficult, that would be one way to do it. And if you want to make sure that someone's not going to follow through with what you're asking them to do, do than to, tell them to do something like that,
Yeah.
versus like I said, just change your cadence and we give you the feedback and you can see what your number is, and then you try to get that up a little bit, and then you'll figure out the best way. It taps into more of those automatic processes that we all have, and
Yeah.
that's going to be much more efficient for you, and it's much more efficient from a motor learning standpoint
Yeah.
as well. Now, with that said, I would say that probably of runners that I see, I don't know, 1 out of 5, 1 out of 6, I might do some sort of gait modification with them, and it's only a temporary thing. And the only reason why we do that, we treat it as an adjunct,
Mm.
just to get them over that hump and get them back to running. And then after a while, I don't care if they look like that 6 months from now.
Yeah.
And that's what we see in our data, is we see people start drifting back to their old way of running,
Yep.
but we don't see them get re-injured. So that means that gait modification served its purpose and it's no
Mhm.
longer needed, and they can move on from that. Just the same as if you're working with someone who has patellofemoral pain, you might tape their knee for a little bit.
Mhm.
They don't need to wear tape the rest of their life.
Yeah.
And so you just see it as an adjunct if you do change someone's gait. I see so many runners come in here who are dealing with Achilles tendinopathy, plantar fasciopathy, or maybe even metatarsal stress fractures. And I'm like, I'm talking to them, and then I get them up and start looking at them running, and then they have like a really awkward like 4-foot strike pattern, and I was like, all right, time out. Is this your natural way of running? And then they talk
Mhm.
about, oh, well, no, I saw a PT who told me that, or my coach told me that running with a 4-foot strike was more efficient or is going to reduce my injury risk. And I'm like, so how's that working out? I'm like, when you do that, it shifts all those loads down to your plantar flexors, and
Like,
you
not
can't,
worth it.
you can't accommodate that. So
Yeah.
I almost see more problems from people who have, and it's not the runner's fault by any means. They're being told by well-intentioned individuals,
Yeah.
and runners are very serious and they take things to heart, and they're like, I'm going to work on this, and I want to get faster
Yeah.
and everything, and or I want to get injured less, and so they adopt these things, and it's often not. I think we need to, again, go back to some of the assumptions that we held maybe a decade ago and say, oh gosh, was that really, really a good idea?
Yeah. No, I
And,
think
and
that it's so interesting when I kind of think back on just, the evolution in postpartum has actually kind of paralleled a little bit what we've seen in kind of return to sport, because
mhm.
it complex was like the whole thing for a while, and then we realized, gosh, there's actually a lot to be said for load. There's a lot to be said for simplifying, and not necessarily having everything so kind of convoluted and complex. And that kind of brings me to my last question for you, and I'd love your thoughts on those of us that we don't really have a ton. It's getting a lot better in the postpartum space. Like, what do you think when we're kind of taking some of the stuff that you have and
Mhm.
trying to extrapolate it and pull it? Like, what's the benefits of that, and what are the dangers, I suppose?
Yeah, let's see. Thoughts about bar and return. Yeah, so I think one of the things that has been probably most influential for me was a position paper that was published in British Journal of Sports Medicine in 2016. Claire Ardern, who's the editor-in-chief of JOSPT, was the first author on it. And I think it's a wonderful paper. And what it talks about is that return to sport
Yeah.
process. And so a lot of times we think about, oh, okay, we're going to begin the return to sport phase. But what this paper did was it was more of a position statement. It said, really, your return to sport starts on day one.
Yeah.
And the initial phases are, of course, what we typically think of as far as like, your normal rehabilitation exercises. But then it breaks down like this idea of return to participation, and then return to sport, and then return to performance.
Hmm.
And rather than like going, I'm going to return to run, a lot of times people are like, okay, and they immediately go and they sign up for a half marathon. Return to participation is that first stage of that return to run process. And the only goal during that is to be consistent. And that,
Yeah.
whether that consistency means running a mile every day or something like that, it's just getting consistent, because once you get that consistency down, then you can start building on other things. And so return to participation is just running whatever, some like something consistent, like on a treadmill or something like
Yeah.
that. Return to sport then would be adding in some of the more dynamic loads that we like to think about, such as running downhill or whatever is going to be more stressful for that anatomical area. And then
Hmm.
return to performance is actually doing that race. And you should be very thoughtful about every week, like each one of those steps. And if you can do that, I think you're going to have much greater success and be very
Yeah.
deliberate about that. So I think being more incremental, and understand that our physiology and our musculoskeletal system has a finite ability to adapt. and it also has a finite rate that we can adapt to things as well too. So you can't rush that. You can't rush physiology,
Yeah.
and you need to be patient with your athlete. The athlete needs to learn to be patient with themselves. And I think one of the big parts of that is comparing who you are today with yourself today. You know what I mean? Like
Yep.
not comparing yourself with perhaps your prepartum individual,
Yeah.
or me, I'm 48 now and I compare myself with my 28-year-old self, and that's not really being very very fair to myself. I'll never run that fast again, but
Yeah.
I can at least try to get to be more consistent with my running,
Yeah.
and hopefully not get re-injured. So I would say that those would be, I think, thinking about that return to sport and return to performance kind of as a continuum, I think we'll do
Yeah.
much better, and describe that for the athlete, and understand that if you skip steps, I think that's where people go wrong, and I think that that's where they get hurt and they get frustrated and they get stuck kind of in this, like, I'm injured, so I'm going to take a little bit of time off, and then you
Yep.
lose capacity, then you rush back to running too quickly, and then you get re-injured, and you just get stuck in
Yep.
this, like, in this vortex that
Cycle.
you can't
Yep.
really get out of.
Yep. And I think that makes so much sense. One, to understand that as an athlete from an injury, but I think we still have a ways to go, even just as a society, trying to classify the pregnancy and postpartum period in the same way that we would as an injury or after
Hmm.
taking a period of time off. I think there's still a huge gap there, but I think once you make that connection, then it totally makes sense to be like, yeah, okay, if we're going to return in this, that makes, I think, a lot more sense to somebody, from a concept of like ACL or, ankle injury or something along those lines. And so I think that's a narrative that at least we're trying to establish with moms, be like, hey, did you have an injury before? What did that look like? This is going to be very similar to that, even though bringing a small human in the world has its whole other things like sleep deprivation and you're the milk machine. And by the way, you have to learn how to raise a small
Yeah.
human and all the other fun
Uh-huh.
stuff that goes on with that.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
Yeah,
Um,
it's return to injury plus, right? And I don't know about you, but
mhm.
like as they get older, it gets different. Like the time commitment's still there, as we talked about earlier. Like you still have to plan when your workouts in, because when you pick them up from school, you have a grenade. You don't know if they're happy, if they're sad. You don't know how much homework you're going to have to sit on. Like I don't think that, like, the time commitment doesn't change even if they get
Mhm.
older.
No, no, yeah, I used to think that. I was like, "Oh, well, our child is 2, and when he gets to be 5 or 6 or 8, it's gonna get better, we'll have more time," but I mean, we do, but I think that that's just because, my wife and I we're very deliberate in making sure we get our own time to work out, and
Yeah.
I think that's what's gotten better, is we've gotten much more skillful at
Yep.
planning time and getting up early and talking about what we're gonna do for the next week and everything.
You're
I
better at
think that,
logistics.
yeah, yeah, I think so. I think for me, when our son came along, boy, I was in a tailspin for a while. I was like, "Oof." This is
They're tough.
oh,
They're
yeah.
tough.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, they're tough, and I'm still, my oldest, he's 11, and I'm trying to still, like, understand boy language, and he only talks a lot about his day if he's in a vehicle and not looking at me. So we do a lot of driving around, so I know what's going on in his head, where my daughter, who's 8 as well, she's my little chatty Cathy, and I can see myself in her, and we can kinda talk through stuff, but that's a whole 'nother animal.
Mhm.
Whole 'nother animal. So
Yeah.
awesome. Well, thanks so much for coming on. If you want to find Rich, this is his actual Instagram, Montana Running Lab. Rich, thanks so much for coming on. If you have questions, go ahead and hop over to him on Instagram. And yeah, we'll keep looking for all your papers that hopefully will get published soon. And any more myths are over on his Instagram as well. Thanks,
Thanks,
Rich.
Carrie. Appreciate it. It's been wonderful.